There hasn't been a new Legacy of Kain game in 2 decades, but nevertheless, 2024 has been a great year for the series. Not only are we getting a brand new remastered collection of the first 2 Soul Reaver games, but Evercade also released their own compilation that included Blood Omen, Legacy of Kain, and Legacy of Kain Soul Reaver. Yeah, that's cool news, but are any of these games actually worth playing? To answer that question, I decided to flip through the pages of Electronic Gaming Monthly, Computer and Video Games, Next Generation, and more classic magazines to see what the critics said about this entire franchise when the games first came out. Get ready to push some crates because this is another blood-sucking episode of Legacy of Kain Review Crew.
It's my bath time. There's nothing I like more than a good, warm, cozy bath. In fact, I think I'll just turn this heater up a little bit.
What a bonehead. But at least he got to keep his soul. Introducing a world where you take more than life. You take the soul. Soul Reaver.
While most horror games of the 1990s had you playing as a human trying to escape a nightmare filled with monsters, Blood Omen, Legacy of Kain went the opposite direction. Developed by Silicon Knights and published by Crystal Dynamics, this overhead adventure game tells the story of Kain, a man who's killed at the start and then given the opportunity to return to life in order to get his sweet, sweet revenge. The rub, of course, is that he returns as a blood-sucking vampire, forcing our hero to kill countless innocent people in order to stay alive long enough to complete his quest. Although it looked a bit dated compared to the flashier horror games on the PlayStation, the fans immediately fell in love with the dark story and impactful violence. The tug-of-war between your morals and the objective weighed heavily, and the game was willing to go places that other horror games just simply refused. Couple that with excellent voice acting and surprisingly strong writing, and it's easy to see why the game was able to find a dedicated fan base that stuck with the series through thick and thin. Now, when it came to the reviews, the scores were surprisingly consistent, with pretty much every magazine giving the game their version of 80%. In fact, it was Electronic Gaming Monthly who gave Blood Omen the highest score, giving it an 8.6 out of 10. Dan called it dark, gloomy, and violent. A typical day at EGM? Nope, it's the new RPG Legacy of Kain. Call me old-fashioned, but I still prefer party RPGs with turn-based combat. But for having a single guy running around fighting in real time, Legacy of Kain is not bad at all. Why? Because it's different from everything you've seen before. The narrator tends to talk too much, though. His stories do add to the game, but I didn't really listen to him half the time. A very good, unique game. I hope we see more. Sushi X liked the game even more, saying that Legacy of Kain creates that little fuzzy feeling inside. This wild adventure has the best plot of any PlayStation game to date. It's not for the faint of heart or weak of stomach. Kain has a permanent home in my game library. The graphics set the mood perfectly, and the ominous music is purely genius. Even the background noises are amazing. Let's go ahead now and jump from the highest score all the way down to the lowest. That comes to us from none other than Edge, who gave Blood Omen a score of 6 out of 10. How do you repackage old games for a new audience? Legacy of Kain's twist is to make the protagonist an anti-hero, a rapacious vampire who needs to sustain himself on the blood of innocents. Such desperately controversial elements have already wanted an enthusiastic stateside audience where it benefits from a dearth of competition. Kain marries old-fashioned 2D overhead hack-and-slay mechanics with sub-Zelda puzzles. Each of its trap-laden puzzles rewards the player with a new weapon, a death spell, or a traditional vampiric form. Legacy of Kain never surpasses what it imitates, however. Take away the full-motion video and you could be playing any Super NES action RPG circa 1994. a lack of flair detracting from an otherwise amusing romp. Alright, like I said, every other critic outside of EGM and Edge gave the game what was the equivalent of an 80%. Computer and Video Games gave it a 4 out of 5. GamePro gave it a 4 out of 5. Next Generation gave it, you guessed it, a 4 out of 5. Even when we go all the way over to Australia, Hyper gave the game an 80%. Sure, they took issue with the dull combat and some of the life and death mechanics, but in the end, they liked Blood Omen. Legacy of Kain is certainly long enough to keep your average RPG fan going for a while, and some of the parts of the game are quite nasty. There are multiple boss opponents, etc., etc. It may not appeal to those RPG gamers who love their stats and stuff, as you've really just got 2 meters and an item screen, but it's all the same in essence. A good game that some lucky distributor will no doubt snap up. You know what? I actually think that sums it up fairly. While it certainly looks dated, it's fun to go back and see the game that started it all. Blood Omen is definitely worth checking out. Coming out 3 years after the success of Blood Omen, Soul Reaver takes the series in a bunch of new directions. For one thing, Silicon Knights was out, and not exactly happy about it, replaced with Amy Hennig and a bunch of the Crystal Dynamics programmers. We also got a new hero, Raziel, as well as a brand new 3D camera perspective that made it look a lot more like the action-adventure titles that were popular at the time. Now, all of this change could have been a big risk to the franchise, but the fans were on board, thanks in large part to the fantastic world building and a well-told story. It also turns out that Raziel is an incredibly memorable character, helping to show this world from a completely different perspective. But the question still remains, what did the critics think of all of these changes? Let's find out. Look, there's no question, the critics definitely preferred this follow-up, as the scores are up across the board. In fact, I'd argue that the lowest score, a 78%, isn't even all that low. That score belongs to GameFan, who thought the game was okay, if not a bit disappointing. ECM explains that what promised to be Game of the Year material so long ago has proven to be nothing more than a very rushed, decent effort by the fellows up at Crystal D. While the engine is still quite strong, the parallel world gameplay is sorely lacking, simply leading to one more step and some very monotonous puzzles. Dango Head ended up liking it the most, but still agreed with his colleagues. After waiting nearly 2 years for Soul Reaver, the question must be asked, was it worth the wait? While the overall visuals are a bit dated, the level designs are great, the puzzles are quite challenging, and the gameplay isn't bad. So, if you're looking for a good 3D adventure game, Soul Reaver should be it for you. However, if you're like me, who was looking forward to a monumental sequel to Blood Omen, then you'll probably be disappointed. The good news is the GameFan was one of the few magazines disappointed with the sequel. Next Generation gave the game a strong score of 4 out of 5, which is pretty much the same thing that Edge did when they gave it an 8 out of 10. For their part, Electronic Gaming Monthly liked the game a bit more, giving it an 8.75 out of 10. Che liked it the least, giving it an 8. When it came down to it, I had a hard time believing that I was actually playing Soul Reaver. I've waited and waited and then waited some more for this game. It lives up to the expectations in terms of the graphics and presentation, but I wasn't expecting all the puzzle-based gameplay in Kain. I felt like I was playing Tomb Reaver, having to push those blocks around. Dean liked the game a little bit more, especially its size. This monster is well worth the wait, and I do mean monster. It's huge. You'll be playing this until Christmas. The environments are really pretty, lots of rich color and shifting light effects. That and the suspenseful music make quite a freaky atmosphere. You'll never feel overwhelmed with enemies or hopeless situations. Soul Reaver is a very tastefully done game. Now, moving up the list, the official US PlayStation magazine gave the game a 4.5 out of 5, bridging the divide between EGM and the perfect scores. Insight was one of those magazines that actually gave the game a perfect score, going with a 5 out of 5. That's the exact same score you saw over at GamePro, and Computer and Video Games also went with a 5 out of 5, arguing that looks can be deceiving. On the face of it, Soul Reaver looks amazingly atmospheric, but dull. The thing is, because it looks like it does, you tend to not notice if there are some barren stages. Some of the puzzles are very tough and will almost definitely have you tearing your hair out until you've worked out the incredibly simple solutions. This deserves credit for being a real sequel rather than just an add-on to the previous game, Legacy of Kain. It's better looking than Tomb Raider and has more going on than some of those Lara games. It's really creepy too, when you panic when you see creatures and start slashing wildly to kill it as quickly as possible. You almost get the shivers. While Game Fan may have been disappointed with Soul Reaver, the fans disagreed. Most people were excited to see the series go in a new direction, and while some of the elements are dated, it's still a lot of fun to go back and revisit.
Okay, I got this rocket off of the surplus store, and hey, watch it. I'm gonna be the fastest human being in the world. Just light her up and... All I gotta do is flip this switch.
Idiot. But at least he got to keep his soul. Introducing a world where you take more than life. You take the soul. Soul Reaver.
Only 2 years after introducing the world to Raziel, the Legacy of Kain returns with Soul Reaver 2, this time on the PlayStation 2 as well as the PC. This third installment refined what worked with the previous game, all while offering a tighter adventure with more exploration and better puzzles. This is also a more exciting game, brimming with fast-paced action and exciting set pieces. Unfortunately, the short window of time between the first and second Soul Reaver games rushed the project, something the developers have lamented about more than a few times in recent years. However, was this going to be the thing that kept critics from recommending this next-generation sequel? Well, let's find out. When it comes to Electronic Gaming Monthly, they felt that Soul Reaver 2 was a big step down from the last game. Chris gave it a 5.5 and summed up the sequel this way. To paraphrase a comment from one of the voice actors in the outtake sections of Soul Reaver 2, for a video game, this sure has a lot of talking. After a while, my eyes just glazed over every time a cinema began. Watching two characters stand there and talk for 2 minutes with no action over and over isn't my idea of a good time. So much attention was paid to the complex story that the repetitive puzzles feel like an afterthought. Decent, but Raziel is showing his age. Milkman liked the game a little bit more, but was still disappointed. I enjoyed the first Soul Reaver's gothic trappings and ambitious level designs, but never really liked the vague level objectives and the box-pushing puzzles. 2 years have passed, and aside from larger, more breathtaking architecture, I failed to see what all the fuss and the constant delays were for. As an aesthetic showcase, Soul Reaver 2 triumphs, but the mediocre gameplay will only appeal to fans of the first game. EGM gave Soul Reaver 2 an average score of 6 out of 10. While Electronic Gaming Monthly gave the game the lowest score, they weren't alone. Edge also gave Soul Reaver 2 a 6 out of 10. GamePro didn't like it much better, giving it a 3.5 out of 5. That said, PSM went all the way up to an 8 out of 10. That's pretty much the same as the 4 out of 5 that you saw coming out of Next Generation. Soul Reaver 2 expands upon the strengths of the original game in every way. The combat in particular has been beefed up thanks to the addition of projectile weapons, and the puzzles are more thoughtful with less emphasis on manipulating blocks. The gameplay is utterly absorbing. Some of the architecture is brilliant, and we often pause just to look around and take it all in. The game cleverly shifts between the material and the spectral realms, forcing you to look creatively at most situations. And the combat is both simple and fun. Yes, at times it can be frustrating with its meandering, endless exposition, but few titles can match its eerie atmosphere. If you're looking for a higher score, then let's take a trip over to Game Informer, who gave the game an average score of 8.6 out of 10. Now, it's worth noting that the lead critic on the review, Andy, liked the game a little bit more, giving it an 8.75 and explaining that the story is really what Soul Reaver 2 is all about. And it's the thing that really got me hooked. I was pretty confused for the first couple hours, but once the plot starts to unravel, I couldn't put the controller down. Sure, some of the puzzle logic is insane, and the time travel story gets a little convoluted. But overall, Soul Reaver fans will get everything they could ask for from the sequel. And that's what it all comes down to, how much you like the story. If you get caught up in it, like Game Informer, then the endless dialogue won't be a problem. However, if you're not on board with that story, like EGM, then it's just going to be absolute torture. I say give the game a try and see which side you land on. Believe it or not, it took 6 years and 4 entries for the Legacy of Kain series to get back to Kain. Developed concurrently with Soul Reaver 2, this Blood Omen follow-up came out just 5 months later, this time headed by Glenn Schofield. As you might expect, this long-awaited sequel made the transition to 3D, though not everybody was thrilled with the way that was handled. Fans were also disappointed by the repetitive combat, the incredibly easy bosses, the return of the lame box-pushing puzzles, and worst of all, the weak story. From a narrative perspective, this was a huge step backwards from not only the original Blood Omen, but also Soul Reaver. Let's see how all of this affected the review scores. When it came to the reviews, Electronic Gaming Monthly was the magazine to give it the highest score, as well as the lowest score. Let me explain. When they reviewed the Xbox version in issue 155, they gave it an 8.5 out of 10 and said that comparing Blood Omen 2 to the PlayStation 1 prequel is like comparing Count Dracula to Count Chocula. They're similar in name only. Rather than another RPG, this is a straight action title with a little bit of puzzle solving. And since the game simply herds you from one event to the next, you're never at a loss at where to go. That's not a knock, though. When the action gets a tad monotonous here and there, the excellent story and gorgeous level designs kept me coming back for more. Blood Omen 2 is tastier than the blood of a pale young virgin on a full moon. However, when Electronic Gaming Monthly reviewed the GameCube version in issue 163, they knocked 2 full points off the score. Kain's flight from the dark land of Nosgoth must have hit some killer delays on its way to the GameCube. Hell, the PlayStation 2 and Xbox versions came out 11 months ago, so this belated port lands on the shelves alongside the other consoles' discounted copies. Is Blood Omen 2 for the GameCube worth picking up if you missed the previous incarnations? If you're really hungry for a solid action-adventure title, then go for it. It's packed with sprawling urban landscapes, an intriguing story, and several clever magical powers that add up to a lot of otherwise rote gameplay. It's not all blood and roses, though. For an undead ruler, Kain sure has to flip a lot of switches and push around oodles of crates. These simple, dull puzzles detract from an otherwise well-paced adventure. EGM gave Blood Omen 2 on the GameCube a score of 6.5 out of 10. The rest of the magazines fell somewhere in the middle. Computer and Video Games went with a 7 out of 10, while Game Informer went all the way up to a 7.5 out of 10. GamePro went a little bit higher, giving the game a score of 4 out of 5. You'll probably wish there was more behind Blood Omen 2's bloody, amusing facade than just another 3D action-adventure. But there's not. A solid story and high frequency of wholly immoral acts of horrifically violent fun is what ultimately lifts Kain above his crate-pushing heritage. Just suck it up and move on with your own life. Now, when it comes to the reviews, the scores are a bit higher than Soul Reaver 2, but also much lower than the previous Blood Omen game. The one to get is the one on the Xbox, while most of the magazines agreed that you should probably skip the GameCube port. Just know what type of game you're getting yourself into.
So when you're making my special ribs, the most important thing is to make sure you get all the coals covered with a lot of stuff, because there's nothing worse than a fire that isn't hot enough to cook these ribs. So here you go. You got to get them all covered. boy, I'll tell you, nothing better than ribs off of a good hot grill, huh? You know it. Okay, get them all. There you go. Okay. Now, piece of resistance.
What a moron. But at least he got to keep his soul. Introducing a world where you take more than life. You take the soul. Soul Reaver.
Dad?
Now that Kain and Raziel have starred in 2 games each, there's really only one thing left to do. And that is to merge the 2 series into one story to create the Legacy of Kain Defiance. This final installment also brings back Amy Hennig, who was able to craft a far more interesting story that actually gave both characters something to do. The big change came in the form of the camera perspective and gameplay. Released in 2003, Defiance was clearly inspired by Capcom's Devil May Cry series. It gave us a lot of fixed camera angles that made the combat faster paced and more visually exhilarating. Of course, the trade-off was that the exploration and the platforming was a real pain, leaving some longtime fans to wonder why Crystal Dynamics didn't just work on refining the gameplay found in the last 3 installments. Let's see if these changes impacted the reviews back in 2003. This time around, Electronic Gaming Monthly found itself smack dab in the middle of the list. Giving the game a score of 7.5 out of 10, EGM was a little mixed on Defiance. Joe summed it up this way: Legacy of Kain Defiance successfully blends the disparate Soul Reaver and Blood Omen franchises into one grisly, beautiful package. The game's environments are full of jaw-dropping, ornately detailed Gothic cathedrals, craggy, cavernous catacombs, and spooky netherworlds. Likewise, the series' much-improved combat system is a true black-hearted pleasure, allowing you to juggle opponents in the air and use telekinesis to toss them into hazards such as fireplaces and spikes. But Defiance has a dark side, an unintentional one. The series' near-perfect follow camera has been sacrificed in order to give you a better view of the fights, and it's tougher to perform platform jumps now because of it. That all said, Defiance still has a compelling enough story and strong enough gameplay to make you see it through all the way to the bloody end. John also liked the game. The Kain games exist, first and foremost, to tell a story, and like its predecessors, Defiance flows plot points together with considerable grace. But, for the first time, I'm actually excited about the combat between the cinemas. Still, despite these fixes to the series' traditionally bland gameplay, Defiance feels rushed. All too often, glitchy AI issues and inexcusably bad camera show that a little more polish was needed. As we go down the list, we see that GMR basically agreed with EGM, giving Defiance a 7 out of 10. The official US PlayStation magazine went with a similar 3.5 out of 5. However, the lowest score that I could find came from Edge in issue 132, giving it a surprisingly low 4 out of 10. They said that credit must go to Crystal Dynamics for producing the best looking Kain game to date. The architecture is majestic, and the detail throughout is another sign that we're truly established within the second generation of the PlayStation 2 titles. Combat is less impressive. Enemies feel like they've been added at the last minute, showing no intelligence and slide around the scenery like inept ice skaters. The turgid battling lets an average game down. The puzzles employ the now familiar plane shifting mechanics and are well constructed and designed, while switching between Raziel and Kain adds impetus to the adventuring. Now, further up the scale, we see Game Informer give Defiance a score of 8 out of 10. That's the same score you saw over at official Xbox magazine, as well as the official UK PlayStation 2 magazine. GamePro, on the other hand, gave the game its highest marks, a solid 4 out of 5. Make no mistake, Defiance is a first-rate game with some serious improvements over the previous entries in the series. The flaws, which sound bad on paper, are but tiny specks on the shining glory of Kain's resurrection. Yeah, flawed, but still worth playing is a good way to sum up this final entry in the Legacy of Kain franchise. It really is a shame that production troubles and indecision haunted not only this game, but the entire series as a whole. I don't know, I can't help but feel that both Kain and Raziel deserved better.
What's on the mind of a Blood Omen disciple at a time like this? Blood. Always blood. Find your dark side. Blood Omen 2 by Eidos Interactive. Rated mature.
Hey, thanks for watching me break down these classic reviews. If you liked what you saw here, then you should know that we post new episodes just like this whenever classic games get added to modern consoles. Also, these episodes where I cover an entire series take a really long time to not only research and write, but also to edit. So, if you know anybody who likes this kind of thing, please do me a favor and let them know about Defunct Games. I'd really appreciate it. Now, here's the question I have for you. What's your favorite Legacy of Kain game? I'm assuming it's going to be one of these 5 games and not the cancelled Nosgoth game. Honestly, I can't wait to see your picks in the comments below. I have a hunch they're just going to be all over the place. In other news, we'll be back next week with a brand new EGM Ranks episode that looks at the many different versions of Tetris. While you wait for that, I strongly recommend you click that subscribe button and support what we're doing here. Until then,